Dr. W talks, The Emergence of Monotheism. Monotheism comes from the Greek words mono, one, and theos, God. It means belief in one God or supreme being. Most religions that believe in one God endow this being with a certain set of characteristics. Likewise, most religious believers use a male pronoun to describe this being. We'll discuss this another time. And see him as not just supreme, but supremely just, good, powerful, and knowledgeable. But where did the idea of one God come from? And where do people get their ideas of one God from today? We tend to trace the beginnings of monotheism to the great patriarch Abraham, later called Abraham or Ibrahim, who left his polytheistic culture in Ur to form a new monotheistic tradition. Jews, Christians, and Muslims all trace their origins back to him. But we can also see a belief in a single supreme being emerging separately in other cultures, including in ancient Persia, Egypt, maybe even India, and later Greece. So was Abraham really the first monotheist? If you believe that the writings of the Torah are divinely inspired, you may believe everything it says about Abraham to be literal, and for its existence in the oral tradition to a preserved divine inspiration. In that case, he was called by God 4,000 years ago and left everything to follow that God. But if you follow a literal meaning of the early chapters of Genesis, you would also believe that monotheism had existed since God's revelation to the first humans, Adam and Eve, and had followed a continuous line through Enoch, Noah, and others. In this case, there would be little need to question who the first monotheist might be, as you would think monotheism had always been a thing. If we aim to take a more historical view, Abraham seems to be a strong contender for the first monotheist, but his character is shrouded in mystery. The texts in the Torah that discuss him were not written down until hundreds of years, or perhaps even a millennium after his death. While stories about him were passed down through the oral tradition, some anecdotes about him could relate to others or even be myth. In his book, Joseph and His Brothers, author Thomas Mann suggests that Abraham, while recognised as an ancestor in collective memory, could have really been an amalgamation of people, including Hammurabi, ancient Ammonite king of Babylon, who is famous for instituting a sophisticated legal system there. However, archaeological discoveries in the early part of the 20th century back up the stories of Abraham's travels around the Middle East about 4,000 years ago, showing contemporary settlements in the places he was supposed to have visited. His journeys with his wife Sarah, nephew Lot, and various other companions could well have a fair amount of historical truth in them. We also know that a distinct Israelite people were slaves in Egypt a few hundred years later and trace their origin to Jacob, aka Israel, Abraham's grandson, and his family. But even if we think that Abraham was a real person, some commentators also challenge the idea that Abraham was truly monotheistic, noting the frequent mention of other, rival gods in the Torah and Tanakh, including statues of Baal and Asherah poles used by the Israelites. Even so, the whole focus of Abraham in the story is that he abandoned polytheism and was leading the way in establishing a new monotheistic culture. If we were to reject Abraham as the founder of monotheism, on the grounds that concurrent worship of other gods was occurring, we would have to reject our other contenders as well. Jews, Christians, and Muslims don't all agree about Abraham's line of succession. Jews and Christians see his son Isaac as his successor, whereas Muslims look to Ishmael, his older son by his maidservant Hagar. But they do agree that his descendants formed the monotheistic tribes of the Middle East. Whether completely historical or partly mythological, he remains a crucial figure for the development of monotheistic religions. In easier to define historical terms, we have more solid evidence, quite literally, about Egyptian pharaoh Akhenaten. He is well documented to have rejected the Egyptian pantheon to focus his worship on the sun god Aten in Egypt around 3,300 years ago. Another early monotheist was Zarathustra from northern Iran, who worshipped one god, Ahura Mazda, from whom he had a revelation. He became the founder of Zoroastrianism. However, we're not sure when he lived. It could have been anywhere between 4,000 and 2,400 years ago. He did not reject or oppose the polytheists in his culture, but chose to worship and teach about just one supreme deity, himself. We can see here that many ancient monotheists may have begun as focusing on the worship of one god among many, and eventually moved to rejecting the others as false. This rejection of other religions was a defining characteristic of ancient Judaism, as we can see in the first of the Ten Commandments. But in other traditions, a supreme being has sometimes been seen as a ruler of other lesser gods. For example, elements of Hindu beliefs can be seen as monotheistic. The poetry of the earliest Vedas, such as the Rig Veda from around 3,500 years ago, does mention gods in a pantheon, which changed later in Hinduism, but also looks specifically at an unknown creator deity above the other gods. The Nasadiya creation hymns look to the one that breathed, restless by its own impulse. Other than that, there was nothing beyond. This early Veda could have been based on a much older oral tradition from the ancient Indus civilization, whose script we still can't understand. Although this one may be one among many, in many expressions of Hinduism, all the gods could even be seen as avatars or faces of a supreme, transcendent being. Can we really describe such a tradition as polytheistic, when there is one supreme deity behind all else? This idea of a supreme being has also developed in other philosophical systems throughout the world, for instance appearing as Aristotle's unmoved mover about 2,400 years ago. In conclusion, ancient cultures and religions still have so much to reveal to us. Think of that ancient Indus language that we haven't yet managed to translate. There could well have been strands of belief in one supreme being or deity before the time of Abraham. And even if it was one among many, it was still one to be seen as ruler. Abraham himself is still a mysterious figure, but even if he wasn't the first monotheist, we can still credit him with carrying the banner of monotheism and paving the way for a new tradition that was going to shape the face of religion on earth.